So hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my discussion video for May's chapters of Bleak House in my current ongoing Victorian style serialised read along. So in the month of May we read 3 chapters of Bleak House. You read chapter 8, Covering a Multitude of Sins, chapter 9, Signs and Tokens, and chapter 10, The Law Writer. Lots of stuff to discuss today. So let's start off with Covering a Multitude of Sins. I'll go quickly through what happened in the chapter and then we'll talk about some other points of interest. This is quite a long chapter, so this will probably take up at least half the video. So in Covering a Multitude of Sins, we do cover quite a lot, and we find Esther at home in Bleak House, getting more into her life, getting on with sort of housekeeping work and keeping busy, and also kind of getting involved with some of Mr. Jarndyce's friends and their charitable work, such as Mrs. Pardiggle, who takes Esther and Ada on a visit to some brickmakers' houses where Mrs. Pardiggle thinks she is trying to help and isn't really helping at all, and Ada and Esther, with their kind of more human kindness more than lecturing, end up being able to provide more comfort for a woman who has just lost her child. That is most of what happens in this chapter. For all that it's a long one, those are the main events. So, things of interest in this chapter. Before I talk about charity, which is one of the main themes in this chapter, I do just want to talk about Esther, and Esther as a character, because she's so interesting, and her attitudes towards duty and work and her attitudes towards housekeeping are really, really interesting, as are sort of Mr. Jarndyce's attitudes towards her. She is desperate to be busy and she immediately becomes busy, but she also was given the house keys by Mr. Jarndyce, and Mr. Jarndyce expects her to be busy in a way, and in a weird way her kind of class difference and her social and birth difference from Ada and Richard is preserved. This does not trouble her at all. She feels it is only right and correct, and in fact she really enjoys being busy. She describes what is effectively very, very hard work in quite a kind of light way, as though it is mere play and fun, despite the fact that it does take up so much of her time. Every part of the house was in such order, and everyone was so attentive to me that I had no trouble about my 2 bunch of keys, though what with trying to remember the contents of each little storeroom, drawer and cupboard, and what with making notes on a slate about jams and pickles and preserves and bottles and glass and china and a great many other things, and what with being, generally, a methodical, old-maidish sort of foolish little person, I was so busy that I could not believe it was breakfast time when I heard the bell ring. Away I ran, however, and made the tea, as I had been installed into by the responsibility of the teapot. She loves being busy, and it's important, of course, that immediately after this, Skimpole sits at breakfast and says that he dislikes the fact that honeybees are set up as being a model because they are so industrious, whereas he feels no need to be industrious whatsoever. He is completely idle in comparison to Esther, who feels it her need to be industrious, and yet she never seems to judge Skimpole, certainly at this stage in the book, for the fact that he has no interest or desire in being busy and in working hard, whereas she really wants to kind of attend to her duties and responsibilities and to keep busy. Esther presents herself throughout the book as being incredibly modest and incredibly unaware of her own abilities. When Mr. Jarndyce says, "It is wisdom in you to keep me to the bright side of the picture," she says, "The idea of my wisdom." And later she says to him, "I am afraid that it will be a disappointment to you to know that I am not clever." Indeed, when Mr. Jarndyce asks Esther what she thinks that Richard should pursue for a profession, she says, "Oh my goodness, the idea of asking my advice on such a point." She constantly puts herself down. And yet, sometimes there's a little bit of me that feels that Esther puts herself down so much that she's doing it on purpose. I don't know. I'm still formulating this idea. Every now and then, though, it does feel a bit like too much, almost as though Esther in the future writes this in order to make herself look good rather than because she doubts her own ability, because she does still tell us what other people say for the most part. I think she's quite interesting to look at as a, not exactly an unreliable narrator, but there are points in the story, as I'll talk about a bit later, where she doesn't tell us the full truth, almost in drawing our attention to the fact that Esther is surprised to be asked her opinion. We also take more note of the fact that Mr. Jarndyce does ask her opinion, and we also, I think, do take slightly more note of her intelligence. She's a very interesting character for that, I must say. And I think it's also worth noting that for all that she puts herself down, whenever she talks to herself in her head, she often seems to call herself Esther, my dear, as though she is fond of herself and calls herself my dear, which I both find quite interesting, because I think it suggests maybe that she has somewhat more respect for herself than she sometimes says, and also because it kind of gives the impression that because no one has been sort of kind to her growing up, she has had to be kind to herself, at least in some way, and she calls herself my dear because when she was a child no one called her that. I don't know, that's how I've often read it. I think she is such an interesting character. She takes on this kind of fairy tale quality in the book. Jarndyce quotes a fairy tale at her, and eventually she ends up being called various fairy tale names by those around her, such as Old Woman, Little Old Woman and Cobweb and Mrs. Shipton and Mother Hubbard and Dame Durden. She is constantly given names from fairy stories, and this kind of adds up to the image of her being this kind of almost angelic fairy tale figure at some points. But it's also very interesting, I think, that the characters in the book are constantly renaming her because, of course, the name she has is not a name she has a right to. She don't know who her parents are, but they might well have not had the name that she has been given. We know nothing about her parents or her name. She feels throughout the book the lack of that parentage and the lack of a right to a name. And so the fact that therefore her own name is not used that much by those around her, that they give her different names instead, is really, really interesting in terms of looking at her identity and her sense of identity. I want to talk quickly about Mr. Jarndyce and his critique of the law, just because I think the conversation he has with Esther in this chapter is quite interesting. He tells her a bit more about the Chancery case. And I think it's interesting to look at the differences between Esther and Ada and Richard in terms of how Mr. Jarndyce treats them. On the one hand, Esther has a lot more sort of responsibility and work to do around the house. She is more like an employee. She becomes a kind of housekeeper figure. She's definitely not of as high a class as Ada and Richard. Yet on the other hand, it's her that Mr. Jarndyce chiefly speaks to and speaks his mind to and speaks to on serious things. Although she's only a little bit older than Ada and Richard, Mr. Jarndyce, in a way, treats Richard and Ada as though they are kind of children of his, in a way, whereas Esther he treats slightly differently, which preserves the kind of separation between them, and he speaks to her about more serious subjects than he speaks to Ada and Richard on. He talks to her about the case in Chancery, and again we get this critique of the law. The lawyers have twisted it into such a state of bewilderment that the original merits of the case have long disappeared from the face of the earth. We are always appearing and disappearing and swearing and interrogating and filing and cross-filing and arguing and sealing and motioning and referring and reporting and resolving about the Lord Chancellor and all his satellites, and equitably waltzing ourselves off into a dusty death about costs. That's the great question. All the rest, by some extraordinary means, have melted away. And later, cost is the only power on earth that will ever get anything out of it now, or will ever know it for anything but an eyesore and a heartsore. And he talks to Esther quite openly, despite his dislike in general for difficult topics, about what the house was like when he first inherited it after his uncle killed himself. When I brought what remained of him home here, the brains seemed to me to have been blown out of the house too. It was so shattered and ruined. And you also get a sense of what Mr. Jarndyce is like as a man, of his goodness and his kindness and his wish for comfort, that he has made this place the happy place that Esther and Ada and Richard find it. Now I want to talk a bit about the theme of charity in this chapter, because it's a really important theme throughout the book. In fact, if there are two sort of institutions almost that are criticised within Bleak House, it is firstly the Court of Chancery and Law, and secondly charitable institutions and charity. It's not all aspects of charity that are criticised, but a few sort of particular elements of it. And I think what cuts to the heart of the matter is what Mr. Jarndyce says to Ada and Esther. He says there were two classes of charitable people. One, the people who did a little and made a great deal of noise. The other, the people who did a great deal and made no noise at all. And Mr. Jarndyce, you get the impression, is someone who does a great deal and makes no noise at all. And Dickens applauds Mr. Jarndyce for the good that he does. We know that he has taken in Ada and Richard, though he does not have to. And we know that he took on Esther, paid for her education, and is now giving her a home. And the fact that he knows so many people sort of working in charity shows that he does a lot. But he also is not someone that talks about it. I think it's interesting to note in Bleak House how charity on an individual basis is always applauded. For example, Mr. Jarndyce being kind to other people and giving money to other people, looking after other people when they're individuals, that is applauded. Whereas the kind of charitable institutions are much more strongly criticised by Dickens. And we also get these figures like Mrs. Jellyby and Mrs. Pardiggle, who do a lot of charity, but we are shown to, one, do it to the sacrifice of their family and those around them, and also to do it in the wrong way, especially with Mrs. Pardiggle here. She is very proud to think of all the money and the hard work she gives up for charity, and yet we see when she actually goes to the bricklayers that she has nothing but contempt for these people, that she has no genuine kindness or respect or even appreciation that they are human, that they are as human as her. All she cares about is the appearance of doing good. The first speech we ever get from Mrs. Pardiggle is a list of her children, the amount of allowance she gives them, and where that allowance is all given to charity, something we soon find out the children are not very happy about. We had never seen such dissatisfied children. It was not merely that they were wizen and shriveled, though they certainly were that too, but they looked absolutely ferocious with discontent. As soon as we were out of doors, Egbert, with the manner of a little footpad, demanded a shilling of me on the grounds that his pocket money was aboned from him, on my pointing out the great impropriety of the word, especially in connection with his parent, for he added sulkily, by her. He pinched me and said, "Oh then now, who are you? You wouldn't like it, I think. What does she make a sham for, and pretend to give me the money and take it away again? Why do you call it my allowance and never let me spend it?" And in fact we see that Mrs. Pardiggle's charitable activities and her endeavours to engage her children in them rather than making her children charitable, make them in fact very uncharitable. And before I talk about what happens at the bricklayers, I also want to quickly address one other thing that Mrs. Pardiggle says. She says, "I am a woman of business. I love hard work. I enjoy hard work. The excitement does me good. I'm so accustomed and inured to hard work that I don't know what fatigue is." And I think it's really worth looking at Mrs. Pardiggle and Mrs. Jellyby, because both of them are presented as people who are doing charity and doing it wrong and to the neglect of their own families, but they're also presented as people who love hard work and as people who don't do charitable work for the sake of helping people, but for the sake of working hard and almost as for having something to do. And I think this is quite important to consider, because both of these are women who are intelligent, at least to a certain extent, and who really, really want to work hard and be busy. But as middle-class women, it's not considered their place to. It's not as though they can go and have a profession like many men could. In fact, one of the few spheres in which women led in the 19th century were charities, and so in a way, kind of charitable endeavours allow Mrs. Jellyby and Mrs. Pardiggle to have power and to be able to work hard at something in a way that no other sphere would. And when you look at it like that, I think it is much easier to understand people like Mrs. Jellyby and Mrs. Pardiggle, however dislikable they may be. The scene at the bricklayers is very, very important, I think. And we see the kind of misery of this place from the beginning, a critique of poverty that we see again and again in this book and so much of Dickens. One of a cluster of wretched hovels in a brick field, with pigsties close to the broken windows and miserable little gardens before the doors, showing nothing but stagnant pools. The first thing that Esther and Ada see is somewhere that is uncomfortable and miserable to live, but the first thing Mrs. Pardiggle sees is somewhere that is unclean and that people are not looking after properly. Mrs. Pardiggle leading the way with a great show of moral determination and talking with much volubility about the untidy habits of the people, though I doubted if the best of us could have been tidy in such a place. And we know from the conversation that proceeds between one of the brickmakers and her that she has been there several times before, that she is always that moralising, that she always tells them off for the way they live rather than trying to help them, and that her means of charity is not giving food or comfort, but by giving them books that none of them can read that are supposed to moralise them. The man says, "No, I ain't read the little book what you left. There ain't nobody here as knows how to read it, and if there was, it wouldn't be suitable to me. It's a book fit for a babby, and I'm not a babby." The fact that Mrs. Pardiggle has left them a book that he says is fit for a baby suggests that kind of paternalistic, moralising, dictating tone which Mrs. Pardiggle takes with them, telling them what to do and how to live their lives rather than actually kind of giving them help. Esther and Ada both felt intrusive and out of place, and we both thought that Mrs. Pardiggle would have got on infinitely better if she had not had such a mechanical way of taking possession of people. What Dickens is criticising is not sort of charitable instinct or charitable acts, but charity gone wrong. And in fact, we see that what helps people and what gives comfort to the brickmakers is not Mrs. Pardiggle's moralising force, but Esther and Ada and their human affection and emotion. Such compassion, such gentleness as that with which she bent down weeping and put her hand upon the mother's might have softened any mother's heart that ever beat. The woman at first gazed at her in astonishment and then burst into tears. It is that human kindness which Esther and Ada show by comforting Jenny as Jenny's just lost her child and Esther covers the child with her handkerchief. It's that which gets a response from the characters. Finally, before I move on to the next chapter, let's just dwell upon the final interesting paragraph in this chapter, just to look at the significance in terms of foreshadowing and hinting at things in the future. How little I thought when I raised my handkerchief to look upon the tiny sleeper underneath and seemed to see a halo shine around the child through Ada's drooping hair as her pity bent her head. How little I thought in whose unquiet bosom that handkerchief would come to lie. Moving on to chapter 9, Signs and Tokens. In this chapter, Esther tells us a little bit more about the relationship between Ada and Richard as she watches them falling in love. And then Mr. Jarndyce's old friend, Mr. Boythorn, comes to stay. Mr. Boythorn, who is very entertaining. I love his dialogue. He's a wonderful character. And then towards the end of the chapter, who should turn up but the wonderful Mr. Guppy, who we have encountered earlier on. Mr. Guppy has come to see Mr. Boythorn on business, but afterwards he stays for lunch and then proposes to Esther just for exciting, fun, hilarious drama. It's very entertaining and a little bit silly. And it moves Esther first to laughter and then when she is alone also to tears. So let's talk a little bit about Richard and Ada. I love the way that Esther writes about watching them because it's very, very sweet and shows quite a lot about the kind of good friendship between the three of them and her knowledge of the particular relationship between Ada and Richard. He was very, very, very fond of Ada. I mean it, and I had better say it at once. I had never seen any young people falling in love before, but I found them out quite soon enough. Richard is a very interesting character, and I will have a lot to say about him throughout this read-along. But I think the kind of mixture in him between deep love of Ada, deep kind of agreeableness and affection for those around him, but also his kind of carelessness, especially about money, as we hear about in this chapter, is really, really interesting. On the one hand, he is determined and kind and very considerate of those around him. On the other hand, Richard sometimes has a little bit of skimpole in him, not quite knowing enough about the world and not quite understanding or caring very much about money. And it's suggested that this is partly to do with the law case and his expectations. The idea of starting on a career and working hard seems almost pointless to him when he knows that there is potential money that he could inherit, except that no one knows when the case is going to be resolved and it's been going on for so long. "I apprehend it's pretty clear," said Richard to me, "that I shall have to work my own way. Never mind, plenty of people have had to do so before now and have done it. I only wish I had the command of a clipping privateer to begin with, and could carry off the Chancellor and keep him on short allowance until he gave judgment in our case. He'd find himself growing thin if he didn't look sharp." And now let's talk a bit about Boythorn, because Boythorn is a glorious, glorious character and a real favourite of mine in Bleak House. One of those eccentric characters that could only be created by Dickens. And he's very eccentric, but he's very differently eccentric to Mr. Jarndyce, although you can really see why they would be friends, which is one of the things I quite like about their relationship. Mr. Boythorn is silly and exaggerated, but while Mr. Jarndyce avoids all unpleasant conversations, Mr. Boythorn is quick to be angry at everyone in a very kind of blustering, friendly way, where even his anger is a joke. Jarndyce says of him, "He was then the most impetuous boy in the world, and he is now the most impetuous man. He was then the loudest boy in the world, and he is now the loudest man. He was then the heartiest and sturdiest boy in the world, and he is now the heartiest and sturdiest man. He is a tremendous fellow." And the first words we ever hear from Boythorn's mouth are just hilarious. "We have been misdirected, Jarndyce, by a most abandoned ruffian, who told us to take the turning to the right instead of to the left. He is the most intolerable scoundrel on the face of the earth. His father must have been a most consummate villain ever to have had such a son. I would have that fellow shot without the least remorse. I have not the slightest doubt that the scoundrel has passed his whole existence in misdirecting travellers. By my soul, I thought him the worst looking dog I have ever beheld when he was telling me to take the turning to the right, and yet I stood before the fellow face to face and didn't knock his brains out." And later in the chapter he calls Celeste a deadlock, the most stiff-necked, arrogant, imbecile, pig-headed numbskull ever, by some inexplicable mistake of nature, born in any situation of life but a walking stick. It's so very Dickensian and silly, and I love it very, very much. And yet his anger is to be taken as good humour, and Esther in fact says that one might have supposed that he had had not a care in the world or a dispute or a dislike, but that his whole existence was a summer joke. In comparison to Skimpole, he's quite a nice change and quite interesting to consider. Harold Skimpole is someone who at face value is all charm, but underneath is willing to take advantage of people, whereas Mr. Boythorn pretends to be angry all the time, but actually underneath is a really kind man. And we get to see another instance of Esther's kind of intelligence and emotional intelligence when she works out, just by kind of observing Mr. Boythorn and his attitudes towards women, that he was due to be married once, and somehow that didn't quite work out. And then the final part of this chapter, when Mr. Guppy proposes to Esther. This is a very interesting passage, because it's both really comical and kind of sad on both parts, from both Mr. Guppy's perspective and Esther's. Important to note as well that this for Esther is entirely unexpected, partly because she has such a low opinion of herself and she just can't understand why Mr. Guppy keeps staring at her, and then when he gets down on one knee she is quite shocked. In many ways this is quite a hilarious scene. Mr. Guppy was introduced to us from the beginning as a rather comical figure. There's something almost Mr. Collins about Mr. Guppy in some ways, except that I think you do genuinely see that he does have a great kind of respect and affection for Esther in the way that Mr. Collins doesn't really have for anyone. It's significant as well that he refers to her as Miss Summerson Angel, when we get so many images in this book of Esther as this kind of angelic figure who is entirely good. Mr. Guppy, in an attempt to be romantic, keeps on using old-fashioned language like thee and thy. He gets down on his knees, which is something very few characters in Victorian novels do when proposing. And when he leaves after Esther has rejected him, he gives her his address so she should know where to find him, or to find his mother if he is removed or dead of blighted hopes or anything of that sort. And yet Esther's reaction after the scene is quite important. When I went upstairs to my own room, I surprised myself by beginning to laugh about it, and then surprised myself still more by beginning to cry about it. In short, I was in a flutter for a little while and felt as if an old chord had been more coarsely touched than it ever has been since the days of my dear old doll long buried in the garden. And this is a reference really back to her childhood and back to the lack of knowledge about her parents. It's important to note that when Mr. Guppy proposes to her, she doesn't say, "No, I don't want to marry you." She says, "That is quite impossible and entirely out of the question." She doesn't say, "I don't want to," she says, "That is quite impossible." And certainly there is no suggestion that she is remotely in love with Mr. Guppy. He is a rather ridiculous figure. But the fact that it moves her to tears afterwards and that she uses those words, "that is quite impossible," and thinks immediately afterwards of her childhood and growing up, reminds us that she is born out of wedlock, and as such she doesn't feel herself respectable enough or in a way good enough for marriage. She doesn't feel that she would be worthy to marry anybody, and Mr. Guppy's proposal kind of reminds her of that. For her it is impossible to marry because of her birth, and because that makes her in many ways an outcast from society. I think that's all I want to say about that chapter, so let's move on to chapter 10, The Law Writer, which is just a quick one. In this chapter we move back out of Esther's narrative into our third person present tense chapters, and we encounter Mr. Snagby, the law stationer, and his rather domineering wife. We then see Mr. Tulkinghorn again, and Mr. Tulkinghorn comes to Mr. Snagby's stationer's shop and asks about a particular bit of law copy, and he asks who copied this. And Mrs. Snagsby tells him it was copied by a man called Nemo, Latin for no one, who lodges with Mr. Crook, who we have met before. Mr. Tulkinghorn goes to Mr. Crook's shop in order to see this man. And when he gets into the room, he finds a stench of opium and the man lying with his eyes open and not responding to anything. So, points of interest in this chapter. I want to talk a bit about Mr. and Mrs. Snagby and their relationship. I really like Mr. Snagsby, actually. A minor character, but one that I think you can see has a lot of heart. And the differences between him and his wife, especially in their natures, is quite interesting. And it's another portrait, as we get so many of within Dickens, of unhappy marriages. I've spoken about this before, how Dickens' books may often end with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 marriages. It's very rare to find actually happily married couples within his novels. Most of the married couples we see are not terribly happy with each other. Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby are not only one bone and one flesh, but, to the neighbours thinking, one voice too. That voice, appearing to proceed from Mrs. Snagsby alone, is heard in Cook's Court very often. Mr. Snagsby, otherwise than he finds expression through these dulcet tones, is rarely heard. He is a mild, bold, timid man with a shining head and a scrubbly clump of black hair sticking out the back. He tends to meekness. Mrs. Snagsby seems to have no greater delight than in finding fault with her servant, and Mrs. Snagsby is said to be jealous and inquisitive, and rumours have it that Mr. Snagsby is sometimes worried out of house and home, and that if he had the spirit of a mouse he wouldn't stand it. Let's talk briefly as well about Mr. Tulkinghorn, such an interesting character. I love the description of his house in this chapter, how his house, like him, is rusty, out of date, withdrawing from attention, able to afford it. The idea that Mr. Tulkinghorn is very old-fashioned, as we've been told before, and that he is able to afford to be old-fashioned. And this interest in this particular document is interesting in itself. Interesting that he has gone to such lengths to pursue a document. He not only goes to the trouble of seeking out Mrs. Snagsby to find out who copied this law document, but when he gets to the house, he sends Mrs. Snagsby home, walks on, and then waits and walks back in order so that Mr. Snagsby will not think he has gone there. And of course, when he goes into the house and finds himself in the room of Mr. Nemo, things are not necessarily as they expected they would be. This is the description we get of the room and the man within it. He lies there, dressed in a shirt and trousers with bare feet. He has a yellow look in the spectral darkness of a candle that has guttered out, until the whole length of its wick, still burning, has doubled over and left a tower of winding sheet above it. His hair is ragged, mingling with his whiskers, and his beard, the latter ragged too and grown, like the scum and mist around him in neglect. Foul and filthy as the room is, foul and filthy as the air, it is not easy to perceive what fumes are those which most oppress the senses, but through the general sickliness and faintness and the odour of stale tobacco there comes into the lawyer's mouth the bitter, vapid taste of opium. And the chapter ends just as Mr. Tulkinghorn's candle goes out. I think that's all I wanted to say today about those 3 chapters in Bleak House. So many exciting chapters to come. I love this book so much. In the month of June, we will be reading the next 3 chapters of the book, which are chapter 11, Our Dear Brother, chapter 12, On the Watch, and chapter 13, Esther's Narrative. I love this book so much, and I'm just really excited to talk about the rest with you as we go on. So please let me know down in the comments if you read May's chapters of Bleak House and if you enjoyed them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.